in Japan. So we have Bo Jacobs with us, and we will be right back. So please stay tuned. Thanks for joining, everyone. We have Professor Robert Jacobs, or Bo Jacobs, here today talking about nuclear realities. Thanks so much for joining us, Bo. I know you're so busy this time of year.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Joy. I'm really happy to be here.
You're doing so many exciting projects and everything this month. We'll talk more detail about a bit later. Would you mind just introducing yourself before we start?
Yeah, sure. Sure. I'm an American. I'm a historian of science and technology, and my research focus is on the history of nuclear technologies. So I study nuclear weapons, nuclear power. I study what I call the technopolitics of radiation, like how we talk about how radiation is dangerous and whether we should worry about it and who should worry about it and how people are affected by it, and also how it behaves in the ecosystem. And so a lot of my early work was on what's called nuclear representation, which is how art and popular culture communicates nuclear issues to people. And for the last 10 years or more, I've been working on a project that I conduct with a friend of mine from Australia called the Global Hibakusha Project. And essentially, this project is looking at all of the people who've been affected by radiation and nuclear technologies since 1945. We tend to think of this as something that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that we hope it never happens again. And that is the only time people were directly attacked with nuclear weapons, but there have been 2,000 nuclear tests since then. There's been massive production of plutonium and nuclear materials. There's been nuclear accidents. So millions of people all over the world in all kinds of places have been affected by nuclear weapons, by radiation, by power plant accidents. And also, I am very focused in recent years on the problems of nuclear waste, of the long-term storage of spent nuclear fuel, which has to be kept safe and contained for 100,000 years. So I've been in Hiroshima for 15 years, and Joy, we've known each other about that long. And so it's a pleasure to join you here. And it's always strange to be an American in Hiroshima who's focused on nuclear weapons.
But it also seems a very good place to be.
It really is. I mean, for all kinds of reasons. One of the main ones being that in my field, among my peers, people working on this topic, everybody comes through Hiroshima. So in a short time after being here, I had met all kinds of people that I was thrilled to be able to get to know them as friends as well as to know their work professionally. And it's a place where peace culture and work on these issues is really, this is the center of where a lot of that comes from or is expressed through. So Hiroshima is really an amazing place to call home.
Yeah. I want to mention before we dive into more details about your upcoming webinars. Can you give us
Yeah.
a run through?
Yeah, this is a webinar that it will be on the morning of August 7th in the United States, in the afternoon of August 7th in Europe, and late at night here in Japan. I'll be speaking with two professors who are actually in Chicago, which is my hometown, Norma Field at the University of Chicago and Yuki Miyamoto at DePaul University. And the webinar will be focused on, the title of the webinar is Managing Nuclear Memory, the Journey from Hiroshima to Fukushima. So rather than being a commemoration of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's really focused on how our understandings about risk from nuclear issues has been controlled from Hiroshima, when people first really learned that there was such a thing, through to Fukushima, where it's still being very actively managed, whether we should look at Fukushima as a terribly contaminated place where people are unsafe, or whether we should look at it as something that's fixed and something that's over. And we trace that history through a wide variety of places, all three of us are very involved in issues around Hanford, Washington, where the U.S. produced plutonium. So we'll be talking about plutonium production. We'll be talking about nuclear accidents. We'll be talking about communities that are, in a sense, slated to be exposed to radiation because of test sites and production sites. So it's in commemoration. It's at the commemoration, but it's mostly about how we all inherited the way that societies think about this and the way that governments try to distract people from risk and harm.
Can you introduce Yuki Miyamoto and Norma Field a little bit?
Absolutely. Yuki Miyamoto is a Hiroshima native. So we often joke, that I'm a Chicagoan in Hiroshima and she's a Hiroshiman in Chicago. Um, and she's a professor of ethics. Her focus is on ethics and technology and nuclear issues. She's in the religious studies department at DePaul University. Norma Field is a scholar who spent her career at the University of Chicago. She's an emeritus professor at the University of Chicago, and she's done incredibly important work, especially around women's voices in Japan and leftist voices and dissenting political voices in Japan in the 20th century. And recently, Norma has been very involved in issues around Fukushima and especially the lawsuits that are trying to hold TEPCO accountable and trying to represent the rights and the interests of people of people in Fukushima who have either been harmed or who have experienced financial losses as a result of the devastating accident there. So it will be hosted by Temple University Japan, Kyle Cleveland, who's a sociologist at Temple University Japan, who works a lot on Fukushima issues. And so Temple University of Japan will host the webinar. At the very beginning, we'll each talk for 10 or 15 minutes, but then it'll mostly be dialogue and questions from the audience. And so I know my own website is bojacobs.net, and you can find links there, or you can go to Temple University of Japan and find links there.
Thank you so much. You also have another event with Still Here. Can you introduce that?
Yeah, Still Here is sort of a global commemoration of the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's 15 hours of streaming on August 6th, pardon me, and 15 hours of streaming on August 9th, and there will be a wide variety of content throughout that time. There will be dozens of people representing, including, for example, people at the Marshall Islands where the test site was, people near Kazakhstan, people near production sites in the United States like Hanford, downwinders from the Trinity site, people from all kinds of anti-nuclear groups around the world. There will be different content over all of that time, and under the hashtag of Still Here. And they're talking about the weapons are still here 75 years later. You can find the schedule. There'll also be a link on my website, but it's I think the full website and event name is Hiroshima-Nagasaki 75, all as one word. And my contribution is just a 15-minute contribution that will be at 2:15 Eastern Time in the United States on August 6th. And so because of the time difference, I recorded mine ahead of time and posted that on my Vimeo account where it's available for anybody to see.
Okay, wonderful. And you also said there's another project you're doing with DJ Spooky?
Yes, I'm actually several hours after the first webinar that I talked about. So this will be in the evening on August 7th in America, and it will be in the morning on August 8th. At 9 in the morning Japan time. There's a 2.5 hour event that's part webinar, and there's an opening commentary from Beatrice Finn. But there's a dialogue for about 30 minutes or 40 minutes between myself, Oshiba Sensei, who's the president of the Hiroshima Peace Institute, DJ Spooky, the musician and artist, and also Canon Hersey, the grandson of John Hersey, and artist and video maker. So we're all in conversation, and that will be subtitled in Japanese as well as being conducted in English. there will be several periods before this and right after it where DJ Spooky's music he will be playing music, including a beautiful piece that he did around Hibakusha testimony in Hiroshima. And then there will be breakout rooms on this Zoom call so you can join various of the participants to talk more in depth about some of the topics.
That's wonderful.
And
Are you going to have a link on your Global Hibakusha site or your website?
yes, on my website and on the Global Hibakusha blog, globalhibakusha.com, there'll be links for all of this.
Okay, wonderful. Let's get into your ideas and information about how it's so relevant, this being the 75th year for
Yeah.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I know it's a huge topic. I've got lots of images from your articles that I'll be showing as you talk. So,
Wonderful. Well, I think there's a couple of things that just are really striking and a little bit disorienting right off the bat about this 75th commemoration. Here in Hiroshima, as people who live in Hiroshima, we know that this year was really considered critically important, in part because this is the last big anniversary, 75, in which we anticipate that there will be a lot of participation by Hibakusha. The next sort of big one, which would be the 80th anniversary, the average age of Hibakusha will be around 90 years old. And as you know, August 6th outside in the park is unbelievably hot and humid. And so this was imagined as one of the last times that Hiroshima's message and the testimony of Hibakusha could reach a global audience that was paying attention to Hiroshima on August 6th. Because it was the 75th anniversary, it was also anticipated that the Olympics being held in Tokyo at the same time would result in all kinds of news organizations from countries that would never send a news crew to Japan would be in Japan, and many of them would come to the ceremonies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This would be a chance for Hiroshima, the voice of Hibakusha in person, to reach a really global audience. As we're now right at the point where the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is close to becoming legal, this was part of the idea, was that this would be a really crescendo moment for a lot of peace culture in Hiroshima. And this is partly why it was envisioned as being a critically important time. But in a sense, as you know, everything is disrupted by COVID. And everybody is disoriented and people aren't sure. I heard yesterday that Abe will come to the park. Nobody knows. It's 2 days away, and still people don't really know what's going to happen here or how things are going to be, or if there's going to be anything. The city's not full of news crews the way it would be normally around this time of year. And so while that's really disruptive, there is this way in which it connects in this abstract way back to 1945, which was completely a disruption. I mean, this disruption is nothing like a nuclear attack, with 100,000 people being killed, but it is the normalcy that we expected, all the planning we did, all of the anticipation of how we would be able to do what we wanted to do on August 6th, all of it is just gone. And in a sense, that's there's something a little bit profound about this anniversary feeling this way, feeling so disorienting and so uncertain and so full of dread and distress and disorientation. And so I would say that beyond that, typically this is an event that is really focused on the city center, on Hiroshima. And there's a lot of news crews from around the world that would come here to the park, and there's a lot of coverage, and it's broadcast live here in Japan. And now, instead, what there are is, dozens of webinars being conducted internationally in all kinds of time zones and in all kinds of languages. So rather than being celebrated as a Hiroshima-centric anniversary, in a sense, it's become a global event celebrated by a variety of people within their own context, rather than all centered through Hiroshima as a coordinating and defining point. And as you know, here in Hiroshima, there's long been anxiety about how to keep this memory alive after the generation of hibakusha passes, after people can hear testimony directly from hibakusha. And there's a wide variety of steps being taken to sort of foster the maintenance of this memory, like legacy survivors, which is people who learn the story directly of a specific hibakusha and who will tell that when that hibakusha is not able to give testimony anymore, to keep the live in-person dynamic going. But whatever that is that we get to after the generation of hibakusha passes, this year we're really beginning to feel, instead of something that we're moving towards, we're beginning to feel like this is kind of what it will be like. Obviously, it will change in many ways, but there's there's kind of an indirect profundity to this, because instead of anticipating and planning for how things would be remembered, how commemoration would happen, we're just all having to do it this year. So
Yeah,
it's
you
it, so
mentioned,
it go
yeah,
ahead.
you mentioned before you feel like this year is kind of indicative of how we have to commemorate in future.
Yeah, I think that, and part of that transition is that it's really been observed as a local event that the world needs to listen to. And in a sense, it's transitioning to become more of a global event. There's webinars being conducted in German. There's webinars being conducted in Spanish. There's webinars that are around these issues, but that aren't coming from Hiroshima, and so there's a way in which however this memory evolves, however this memory is maintained, a lot of it will be done in other places, uh, disconnected from the city's centrality, not to the story, not to the memory, but to the events around it. And so that's where we are this year.
That's
Uh,
interesting.
and people used to have to come to Hiroshima. It was a
Yeah.
pilgrimage, right, for peace activists, for anti-nuclear activists, come to Hiroshima on August 6th. And now, it's happening. It's coming into your living room. It's coming onto your computer.
Yeah. I recently, well, we did our last SSL. Thank you for joining that in June. And you were talking a lot about nuclear power and its effect on the legacy of people who's suffering radiation.
Yeah.
Um, this time I came across your USA Hiroshima articles and the One World articles,
Right.
as well as Born Violent. Is there anything that you think is particularly relevant from your previous articles you'd like to talk about?
Sure. Well, just to get to that one world thing, there's an article that I wrote maybe about 10 years ago that links the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the image of the whole Earth as seen from space. And part of the one of the ways the one of the reasons I began to think about it was when I was doing research a long time ago on news coverage of Hiroshima in the United States in the fall of 1945. Immediately when it happened, but also in the fall of 1945 and in 1946, as we're leading up to the first nuclear tests after the war. And I'm just gathering all kinds of material and looking at all kinds of articles, publications around that. And I kept finding these editorial cartoons all that many of them, some of them, in the week after the nuclear attacks here, many of them depicting the world as a living creature, so sort of a globe that's got a face or a globe that's got a body, and nuclear weapons are threatening it, and it's looking scared, and there's some kind of comment being made. And I had long been fascinated by the iconography of the whole Earth seen from space. The basic iconography of that is that the Earth is one place. That when you look at the Earth from space, you realize that all of those, when we look at a globe, what we see is lines between countries. This is the main thing a globe shows us: land and water, but mostly lines dividing countries. When you actually look at the Earth from space, you realize that there are no lines dividing countries, that those are human impositions, and they're only there to the degree that we believe they're there and enforce them. But if you look at the Earth from space, it looks like one place, and it looks like one place that's either going to thrive or not thrive. And that destiny is a destiny of all human beings. And it really doesn't matter what side of a line you're on. I mean, of course, things on Earth, there's war between countries, but this new idea of the Earth as a single place rather than a bunch of different places, it's really easy to grasp that when you look at the whole Earth from space. And when I was looking at these editorial cartoons, they were all rendering the Earth in that same way, graphically, as a living creature, as a single living being, as a single living being whose destiny was now in relationship with nuclear weapons. And either it was going to survive its encounter with nuclear weapons or the nuclear weapons might kill it. So my argument is that this notion of threats that are so big that they are threats to the entire planet rather than threats to my country, threats to my city. Uh, for most people, the beginning of thinking about threats on that scale was nuclear warfare and the threat of nuclear warfare after Hiroshima and during the Cold War. And then when the images of the whole Earth from space in the late 1960s began to be available, they kind of codified that same sense of the Earth as a single place. And it's easy for us to think about in these terms now. For example, we all think about global heating, global warming, and climate change. This is clearly a problem that is a whole Earth problem. Any government can make any policy they want, but it's not going to matter unless we cooperate as a species. This is the only way we can address problems this large. And so this kind of thinking, this kind of global orientation, which is always in conflict with a national identity, with a regional identity, with a city identity, and with a family identity, with all of the kind of tribal identities that we have. For me, the beginning of this came from 1945, from the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And one of the movements right after that was a movement for one world government as a way to manage the threat of nuclear weapons. And so both this notion of the Earth as possibly being able to be killed, like a single creature that could get killed by something, which we still think of with global warming in a sense, or as a place in which there needs to be collaboration and cooperation, on a holistic level in order to address certain threats. This really is connected to the nuclear issue for me, and over time, more I come to think of it in terms of nuclear waste. There's hundreds of thousands of metric tons of just spent nuclear fuel rods that were in nuclear power plants, either to produce plutonium or to produce electricity. These have nowhere to go. These will be dangerous for over 100,000 years, unbelievably dangerous, toxic to living creatures. And so we're now trying to, it's been 70 years and we have yet to really solve this problem in any meaningful way at all. And now the plan that we have, as some people certainly know, is to bury it underground in these deep geological storage facilities underground. There's a movie, Into Eternity, about the site in Finland that's going to bury the nuclear waste from the Finnish nuclear power plants there. And this is the kind of thing, when we bury all this waste, and I can be cynical and I can call it a high-tech nuclear landfill, because the idea is to put it underground where it will be stable for 100,000 years. This is a global act. The countries that have made this waste, the countries that are individually designing their waste sites, they're not going to be here thousands of years from now when this waste is still here. So we're making actions as tribal people, just from Japan or just from Finland or just from the United States, but the threat that it poses to future generations is a much more systemic threat and a holistic threat to the world. So this technology, because of the scale of its risk to us and its risk to 1,000 generations that come after us, it simply is global in its implications in almost every way. I would extend one thing, if I could mention that.
Mm-hmm.
One other way to understand how practical this framework is. Part of why we know so much about how the climate will change is because of radiation. There was so much radiation that entered the atmosphere because of nuclear testing that scientists were able to watch how the atmosphere worked. Because these, just like tracers, radioactive tracers in our body that doctors can see the interior systems, once all this radiation went into the atmosphere, scientists could use it as tracers and began to understand global dynamics of wind patterns and movements of air and particles globally. So as soon as this material began entering into the sea and into the atmosphere, we began to see how these giant systems worked. So from the very beginning, their presence here has had global implications and global effects.
Yeah, I think that's for me one of the most powerful things when we did our talk at the warehouses is you were talking about how every test, every power plant has left damage on the earth and people in people's bodies. It's
Yeah.
so closely related to climate change in so many ways because it's physically altering our world.
Absolutely. And just to give you a practical demonstration of that, it's used to detect forgeries. This dynamic's used to detect all kinds of forgeries. So for example, if somebody was to claim that they had found a new Van Gogh painting, we could tell if it was painted after 1945 or not, because if it was painted after 1945, the fibers in the canvas will have traces of radiation from nuclear weapon testing. So, this is ubiquitous. There's in the mid 1950s, the U.S. government did a study, a top secret study about how far the fallout was affecting human beings, and they collected teeth and bones from 20,000 human beings from all over the world, and they found traces of nuclear weapon testing radiation in almost every sample, no matter where people lived. So it's the world we live in. There's more radiation detectable now in the soil in Nagasaki from nuclear weapon testing than there is from the nuclear attack on Nagasaki.
Wow. I'm on screen right now. I'm showing some of the comics that you're talking
Uh-huh.
about, holding the hand that you have in your articles, your
Yeah.
One World picture from your Asia Pacific Journal article.
Yeah.
Also, comics, American comics,
Yeah.
um, using sci fi or gaming to connect with the bomb experience. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. And, this, I mean, in popular culture, it's been ubiquitous from the very beginning. Nuclear, I mean, we were introduced to nuclear issues as kind of magical technology. Harry Truman told us that it uses the power of the universe and that it came to the United States from God. And so it's always had this sort of, it has the ability to affect genetics, it has the ability to kill at a distance without perception. So it's just always had this kind of magical veneer, this magical patina to it that that continues. Even after the Cold War, we began to make these movies where nuclear weapons were savior weapons that can stop alien invasions and protect Earth from comets. It's just always been seen as a magical technology. And one of the things that I would add again is that it's important to have this long view. We see the weapons, we see the power plants, we get the electricity. Thousands of generations after us will simply have the waste.
Yeah. You also have a really interesting article about how after 9/11, there were a lot of parallels being made in the US about Hiroshima, USA.
Oh, and that began almost immediately, but there was a resurgence after 9/11. You may remember in America there was right after 9/11 there were discussions about how what Al Qaeda wanted to do was to have an American Hiroshima, and there was even an op-ed in the New York Times called "American Hiroshima," which meant smuggling a nuclear weapon into America and detonating it in America. And of course, Hiroshima means victim of nuclear weapon. But, you know, it's ironic that America was the perpetrator of the Hiroshima use, but almost immediately we began to imagine ourselves as the potential victims of nuclear weapons. There was in 1950, the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons in 1949, and America suddenly began to feel very vulnerable. In 1950, there was a cover article on Collier's magazine called Hiroshima, USA, and it
I'm
showed
I'm
nuclear
showing that
attacks.
image right now. Yeah, from your
So
article.
there you go, 1950, we're calling ourselves Hiroshima in America. We're referring to our own vulnerability as we are Hiroshima. So this has been a theme through American popular culture forever. Mick Broderick, my co-researcher in the Global Hibakusha Project, we also curated an exhibition. We wrote an article, but we curated an exhibition on the 10th anniversary of 9/11 in New York, called Nuke New York, where we had essentially 7 decades of images of New York being attacked by nuclear weapons, because that's usually the way it is in the American imaginary. And the very first image that we found showing a nuclear explosion in New York City was August 7th, 1945. It accompanied the newspaper stories of the attack on Hiroshima. There was an image, a map of New York City showing a nuclear weapon and showing you what would be destroyed in New York. And you have this unbelievable graphic, those just gorgeous paintings in that Hiroshima, USA article in Collier's of New York being attacked. And so it's just been a part of the American imagination. And it kind of faded a little bit, but then after 9/11, with this dramatic, unbelievably visual attack in New York City, there's several books called American Hiroshima published after 9/11. And there's really almost never any reflection in any of these things about the original Hiroshima.
And then you have in the same article, you have demonstrations in the 50s, in the 80s, anti-nuclear demonstrations in America, and all of this, publication in the 40s, and then again after 9/11, talking about what if it happens in America. But actually, our nuclear reality now is actually more risky, but there's less public presence in terms of the nuclear issue, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, and it became ironic because it did happen in America. The Nevada test site is the place with the most nuclear detonations on Earth. Over 900 nuclear weapons were detonated in Nevada. And so there were a lot of nuclear weapons going off in America, and a lot of Americans affected by radiation. In the 19 when the tests in Nevada began, which was in 1951 and 1952, the very first tests were broadcast live on television. So you could sit in your living room and turn on the TV and watch nuclear tests live in the United States, watch nuclear weapons being detonated. But because of global opposition to all of the fallout, to all the radioactive fallout, especially from hydrogen bomb tests. Hydrogen bombs make unbelievably more fallout. And radiation was turning up all over the world, so there were a lot of protests in the late 1950s and the early 60s. And so as a result, the main nuclear powers negotiated a treaty to bring nuclear testing underground, to stop testing in the atmosphere. And so that removed mushroom clouds from our visual landscape. We didn't see nuclear weapons being detonated after 1963. And France and China still tested in the atmosphere for a while after that. But mostly the tests were all underground. And so it kind of left our consciousness in some ways. In the 1980s, there was a resurgence of anti-nuclear war and anti-nuclear weapon activism, partly because of the saber rattling of the Reagan administration and the increased tensions between the Soviet Union and the U.S. And one thing that I'd mentioned that often is that we're just now integrating into this kind of history is that in 1983, people know in the Cuban Missile Crisis that we came close to a nuclear war. In 1983, we came just as close to a nuclear war, but it was not public knowledge. It was not known publicly that this happened. And not now, but in the last 20 years, we've just, as historians, begun to grapple with the fact that in 1983, we came, just to the very precipice of a full nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And this was what was called the Able Archer episode, which was that the NATO countries, in preparing to fight a nuclear war with the Warsaw Pact countries, with the Soviet-aligned countries, we had a practice, essentially a war game, where we practiced all of the steps to beginning a nuclear war. All of the leaders of the NATO countries went into secure facilities. Information was shut down, communication was shut down, troops and weapons were put into forward bases. Well, the Soviets, watching this happen, they thought they're about to attack us, and they readied their weapons to attack. And both countries for 3 days, not both. The U.S. was the Western side was practicing, but the Soviets were convinced they were about to be attacked, and that their only chance was to launch weapons first. And then the exercise ended, and it all stepped down. But but in the United States, there's so the testing went underground in 1963, but there's still measurable radiation all over the world from this nuclear weapon testing, and all over plenty of the United States. There's actually a program, the RECNA program in the United States, to give compensation to certain downwinders, people who worked at the test site, people who were irradiated. But it's of course a very limited program. For example, at Hanford, Washington, if you worked at Hanford, Washington, you can get compensation, but your family that also lived in the same community and was exposed to a lot of radiation cannot get compensation.
Wow. Mary has a comment here from Periscope. Thank you, Mary. Do these people who do test runs not know how dangerous it is?
Well, they do and they don't. There's a lot of people involved, and there's plenty of people who believe. There's plenty of people who, while they're in the midst of conducting this, believe that they have competent control over the situation, and they can make sure to test the weapon when the winds are blowing in a way that will make the fallout go not where people live. There's other people, lots of people in the nuclear weapon complexes of different countries who just think that this is just a part of what people have to put up with. One of the AEC commissioners in the United States in the 1950s talked about the people in southern Utah who were being hit with a lot of fallout, and he said, well, people have got to learn to live with the facts of life, and part of the facts of life are fallout. But one of the ways you can tell that they absolutely knew it was harming people is that they did not put these test sites near places that were important to them. So, there was no test site near Washington, D.C. or New York City. The test site was in Nevada, where the people who were nearby were going to be Mormons, Native Americans, Hispanic farm workers, and they had a policy there never to detonate weapons when the wind blew to the south, because it would carry the clouds to Las Vegas and LA. So that means that you blow the weapons up when the wind's blowing to the east, which is saying, yeah, the people of southern Utah, they get irradiated. Also, the United States never tested H-bombs in Nevada. They tested those in the Marshall Islands because they knew that the fallout clouds were much bigger. The British and the French never tested nuclear weapons at all inside their own countries. So, those are decisions that they made because they want to protect their own people from fallout. And that reflects, they clearly know there's harm being done to people from the testing.
Yeah, let's talk about your images of fallout in your article in a moment. But I met you at the Black Lives Matter protest, and your comment really struck me that when you say no justice, no peace in Hiroshima,
Right.
that for Black Lives Matter, that it has power beyond any other location. Can you explain that?
Well, the reason that I mentioned that isn't so much the history or the situation for black people in Hiroshima, although still black people, as we know, are discriminated against in Japan and in Hiroshima, but the potency of the word peace. Everything is peace in Hiroshima. Peace is our brand, peace is our motto, peace is our identity. So to walk down Handori chanting no peace, no justice, no peace is, in a sense, challenging the collective identity on which this town functions. And so I think that for people hearing that, seeing people marching and chanting no peace is just got to be pretty disruptive in a way that it isn't anywhere else.
Right. But as you're talking about, the test sites were never near places they cared about or people they cared about. The idea of racial injustice and nuclear weapons testing or nuclear bombing is so connected, right?
It's nuclear history is a history of nuclear colonialism. Where these sites, I have a book coming out next year based on a lot of this global hibakusha work, and there's a chapter about selecting the sites for the test sites, and the title of that chapter is "Selecting the Irradiated." Um, in the French tested in colonial spaces. They tested in Algeria. Then Algeria became independent, so they tested in French Polynesia. The United States tested in the Marshall Islands, which was a trust territory of the United States. Even domestically, In China, China tested by the Uyghur population. And this is a dynamic we all see in full view now. The discrimination and the harassment and the brutalities against the Uyghur community. That's where they put the test site. Those were the people they irradiated. They didn't put the test sites near the east coast of China. So test sites are always placed near minority populations, near marginalized populations, colonial populations in some cases, and this is another kind of example where you can see this dynamic at work. When the fire, after the explosion at Chernobyl, and the fire is carrying all of this fallout, this massive fallout cloud was beginning to move towards Moscow. And so the Soviet government seeded the cloud in order to make it rain, and they brought all that fallout down in Belarus. This is one of the reasons Belarus is so devastated by Chernobyl, because they selected the people of Belarus to be irradiated rather than the people of Moscow. So people who are exposed to radiation, for the most part, it's not accidental who is exposed to radiation. In environmental history, there's a very deep awareness now that toxic industries are placed in minority communities almost always. And so, the people that are irradiated, the people that are exposed to toxins, are the people without the political power to stop that from happening. And so it reflects, much bigger social dynamics about in-groups and out-groups, and in the United States about white supremacy and the kind of things that have driven so much of the violence endemic and systemic in the United States.
Oh. Speaking of fallout, and these are estimated fallout graphs of what would happen in America if there was fallout from your articles. There's also a picture here of them testing the fish in Japan in the 1950s, and the area that they think would have had fallout for the fishing industry. Of course, fallout cannot be predicted so rationally, we know, after Fukushima, right?
Some aspects can be, some aspects can't be. So there's, at like the Bravo test where the fish were irradiated, that's the mushroom cloud is full of particles and it's drifting, and that cloud, its trajectory can be followed, and a lot of the fallout will come down along that trajectory. But in that case, the cloud goes up so high that a lot of the fallout goes into the troposphere. So it circles the Earth, and it may not come back down for a year or two. So this is how it distributes globally. So we do know that there'll be a concentrated area directly downwind, but beyond that, there's also a lot that's deposited in places we don't know. And once it's deposited, once the fallout particles are deposited, because they're individual particles, they transport in the ecosystem. So after the Bravo test, we found radioactive fish in Australia, in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in North America, in South America. We knew that the cloud deposited a lot of fallout directly downwind, about 1,000 miles downwind from the Marshall Islands, from Bikini Atoll, but there were radioactive fish in South America. Once this material enters the ecosystem, it's like any chemical in the ecosystem. It transports and migrates and moves from and bioaccumulates up the food chain. And so, especially because of really large nuclear weapons, those carried the fallout, as I said, into the upper atmosphere, where it distributed globally.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the image of our round Earth and how our land masses and our air is not does not stop at borders.
Yeah.
It is a global problem. Nuclear weapons, nuclear power is a global problem, just like climate change.
Absolutely. And even in a place like Fukushima, where radiation is deposited into forests and it becomes parts of the plants and parts of the soil, it ends up in berries that birds eat, and those birds fly wherever those birds fly. I mean, we live in a dynamic ecosystem, and things that come down don't stay, nothing stays where it is in an ecosystem.
One of your recent articles about targeting children
Yeah.
with nuclear weapons. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize that there were thousands and thousands of school children here in Hiroshima, and sort of the role that children played in both publicly consumed understandings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and also militarily understood. So the thing we're familiar with is the publicly consumed. For example, probably for most Americans, if they can name anybody who was in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, they name Sadako-san. And she was a child. She was 2 years old when the attack happened. So there's also the first real hibakusha that Americans encountered in American culture were the so-called Hiroshima maidens, who went to the United States in 1955 and 1956 for reconstructive surgery and plastic surgery. And they were all maidens. They were all, at the time that they went, they were in their late teens or early 20s. So they were children. They too were children at the time of the attack. So all around the world, people learned to fold paper cranes, and they learned the story of Sadako-san. So in a sense, and this is not by accident, this is a strategy. The anti-nuclear movement has presented child victims for the world to see. And one of the reasons that the Hiroshima maidens were sent was that if you send young Japanese males, Americans will think of soldiers. So there were young women who were children at the time that were sent. But the more important part to me, and the part that's hidden and cloaked, the United States, after the nuclear attacks, the United States did a lot of studies and a lot of assessments of the effects of the weapons, the effects of the different qualities of the weapons, the blast, the heat, and the radiation. One of the questions that they were really interested in was what percentage of people died by distance? How many people died within half a kilometer? How many people within a kilometer? How many within 1.5? Not necessarily the number, but the percentage. How lethal is it by distance to populations? Because this would help both in planning to use the weapons in war and in assessing its impact if it was used against the United States. Well, when they were trying to do that kind of assessment, it's easy to do assessments on structures. How far did buildings survive? Which kind of building? But in terms of people, it's very difficult because a lot of bodies were vaporized. Plus, in a city of several 100,000 people, you don't know where everybody is at a given time. You can kind of guess, you can do estimates, you can have people talk about, how many people were at work that day. Well, the US began to realize that one cohort, one group of people that it could absolutely identify where they were at exactly that time was school children. And school children were either in school or in specific work parties, and in each school, the parents or other people connected with the school figured out who died and what happened. So this was a mechanism in the community where they could tell exactly how many people died at each location by percentage. So the US systematically studied death and injuries to school children in Hiroshima and in Nagasaki, school by school by school, every single school. And they extrapolated from the mortality of school children that at this distance, the weapon is 75% lethal. At this distance, it's 33% lethal, whatever that might be. And so the metric for understanding the ability to kill with a nuclear weapon in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was dead school children. And this research was conducted, and then this research was shielded so that nobody could see that this was a part of the Strategic Bombing Survey's work, that they used schools as a way to determine the lethality of the weapon. And so, children are always at the center. And you could add to that the fact that radiation is much more damaging to children because their bodies are growing rapidly. So children who are exposed to radiation are far more likely to develop illnesses than adults in a higher percentage and quicker.
In your Vimeo video, which is part of the Still Here project, right?
Yeah.
You show how in Peace Park, in Hiroshima's Peace Park, from the T bridge, you're standing on the T bridge, which was the target for the bombers. You can see A Bomb Dome, which is still a ruin, standing there, showing how close it was to the epicenter. But then you turn around and show a public school.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. This is, and this has to do with, in a sense, how we remember, because part of what we remember, we really globally, we don't remember the absolute brutality of it. You know, for example, much like when Obama came into office, he didn't want to look back at the torture being done by the Bush administration. He wanted to look towards making things better in the future. Even in the anti nuclear community, when we look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we say this was a tragedy, but what we really want is we want to abolish nuclear weapons. But it's really important to look at what we really did, to look at what that tragedy was. So when you're standing on the T bridge, which, as you say, was the aiming point for the weapon, if you look to the east, you see the A bomb dome. And the A bomb dome is a World Heritage Site. It's very visually compelling. It tells a story about the force of the blast and the heat. You can see the mangled building. But it's a Western building. It's a Western design building. So it doesn't look so Japanese. It was a commercial promotion hall, and this was a Monday morning, so it's easy to sort of begin to comfort yourself by saying, well, it was maybe there weren't a lot of people in there. Maybe there were some people in there, but maybe it wasn't full of people. And it's not part of how we talk about the A bomb dome. Who died in the A bomb dome? How many people died in the A bomb dome? We just talk of it as a building, and it's a way to distance ourselves from dead people. And if at that very same spot on the T bridge, you turn the other way and you look to the west, right at the same exact relationship to where you are as the A bomb dome is to the east, is Honkawa Elementary School. And it's rebuilt now, although the elementary school does have a basement that remains as a museum commemorating what happened at the school. But we know exactly what happened in that school, which is that 400 children were killed and 10 teachers. And there's no ambiguity about it. And it was a school, an elementary school. And so part of what I point out in that video is that this weapon was in essence aimed at an elementary school, because the T bridge, the two closest things to the T bridge, on the south of the bridge is the A bomb dome and Honkawa Elementary School. And we remember the A bomb dome, but we don't remember Honkawa Elementary School unless you have a personal connection to the school. But that's what the attack was. The attack was on children. I mean, not just children. There were soldiers here. There were elderly here. There were a lot of people. But there's no forgiving killing 400 school children and somehow calling it, a step for peace, or not calling it a war crime.
No, it's unforgivable.
It's
Um,
absolutely unforgivable. Yeah.
how do we go forward, Bo? We've got a 8 more minutes. What do
Sure.
you? I mean, with all your research, with all your years of following radiation, following nuclear weapons and power for so many years all over the world, not just in Japan, what is our way forward now?
Well, one thing is to be honest about the past. And, of course, I'm a historian, so that's what I'll say. We have to be honest about what happened in order to be able to go forward and make the right decisions. But, clearly these weapons are insane and we need to abolish these weapons. And even if this treaty is going to pass, we also know that the nuclear weapon states are scuttling other treaties and building more and moving towards building more weapons. So the world we're it's becoming more dangerous at the same time that we feel like we're having some power. Um, and so we need to demand to stop funding this. I mean, part of the reason we're so poor in the United States is that this is where our money goes. We can't have nice things in the United States because we have really nice weapons. And we're about to put in 1.5 or $2 trillion into modernizing nuclear weapons, which give us no security at all, really. But the farther thing that I would say is that we need to become really serious about managing the waste. Nuclear war is something that might happen. Hundreds of thousands of metric tons of spent nuclear fuel is something that has already happened. So it's not something we have to try to stop. It's something we have to deal with as best we can. And so this will affect 1,000 generations of people in the future. It will be a risk to them in the future. And so we may well bring the same incompetence to managing that we have brought to testing the weapons, that we have brought to managing things like Chernobyl or Fukushima. So we need to be serious about it. In Finland, we watch this movie Into Eternity and you see this magnificent structure being built to bury this waste. Finland has 6 nuclear power plants. The United States has 100 and massive amounts of fuel from weapon production. So it's going to take so much money, even if burying it underground is the best thing to do, and it may be the best thing to do with this waste. We need to be committed to spending that money over the course of the next 200 years as the American empire and economy declines. So we're on the verge of making more catastrophic mistakes with the waste. Whether we do with the weapons or not, we have the waste, and we're probably not going to take the money that it takes to really address what we've done. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're inflicting violence on future generations. And because it will happen when we can't see it, we'll pretend that it's not going to happen. We'll pretend that just like the fallout isn't going to affect people at the nuclear test, we'll pretend that, oh, burying that waste there, we did that just perfectly, we're done. So we need to continue to engage with this technology, but with a sense of actual responsibility. And I would say when it comes to nuclear waste, we really need to be clear with ourselves that we made a terrible mistake in manufacturing this, and we need to stop manufacturing any more of it. And we need to make commitments to spend the money it takes to clean up our mess as best as we can. So these are some of the things that to me are essential for going forward, for how we go forward. And part of the way we can be honest with ourselves about the risks of the nuclear waste is being honest with ourselves about the impacts of the nuclear testing and the impacts of all of the radiation that was spread around, instead of pretending that fallout isn't a problem for people.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm showing your Global Hibakusha blog right
Thank
here,
you.
and your website, bojacobs.net, globalhibakusha.com. I'm
Yeah.
showing your books. Um,
Oh, thank you.
you did a book actually about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reimagining Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, exactly. That's an edited book. It collects articles, and it's talking about the way that the scholarship around Hiroshima and Nagasaki is shifting now that we've entered the post-Cold War era. That rather than being about the risk of war with the Soviet Union, a lot of the scholarship is shifting to looking at other sites besides Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For example, Global Hibakusha scholarship, but also looking at waste issues, looking at the legacy of the Cold War.
Yeah, we
And
have.
I do have a book coming out
Mhm.
next year about this global hibakusha work.
Wonderful. We have some Mary and Rebecca both saying thank you for all of your
Uh,
work. And I think all of us listening also very appreciative of you helping document what's happening in the past, present, and how you see the future for the good and the bad.
oh, thanks, Joy. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you so much. We have just a few more minutes. I'd love to remind everyone again about your events and webinars this month. Can you give us a run through one
Sure.
more time?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Still Here commemoration that will be streaming on August 6th and August 9th. You can go to Hiroshima-Nagasaki75.org. That's where you'll find information about all of the speakers. And at my Vimeo account, my 15-minute film is there. On August 7th or 8th, depending where you are, there's the webinar with myself and Norma Field and Yuki Miyamoto, hosted by Kyle Cleveland, on managing nuclear memory, the journey from Hiroshima to Fukushima. And then later on, either Friday night in the U.S. or Saturday morning in Japan, there's the webinar with DJ Spooky and Oshiba Sensei from the Hiroshima Peace Institute and Canon Hershey. And there'll be breakout groups and discussions there where people can be in dialogue with all of the participants.
Wonderful. And all of this links and information is available on your website and blog. Is that right?
Absolutely. And if I can also mention, there will be on the news site Counterpunch on August 6th, there will be an article written by myself and Ron Zweigenberg about how we have to topple the statue of the American narrative of Hiroshima. That the story of Hiroshima is one of technological achievement and great scientific work. That is one statue that needs to be toppled.
Wow, fantastic. Ron Klein says Bo is an international treasure. Put him on
Oh,
the road to keep talking truth to power. Thank you.
That's sweet. Coming from Ron Klein, that means a lot.
And Flo Smith says, thank you. I always learn from your talks. Thank you for
Oh, thank you,
joining,
Flo.
everyone. Yeah, thank you so
Thanks a
much,
lot for having
Bo.
me.
And I know you have another talk with Al Jariza right after.
Yeah, yeah, I'm doing an interview with Al Jazeera that won't be live, but it'll be, I think, on their coverage on August 6th.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for everything you're doing. And please take
Uh,
some time to take care of yourself as well. Find some balance. I know
Very
it's hard.
important.
Yeah.
Very important. I agree. And thank you for all you're doing for bringing attention to this sustainability issues and all of the different broad issues that you keep bringing into everybody's home here in Japan is wonderful.
Thank you so much, Bo. I appreciate your support. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And tomorrow at 5 p.m., we have Jackie Steele talking about diversity issues in Japan. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care. Thanks, Bo.